Sigma Kappa wants to invite you to attend the upcoming Acknowledging the Past follow-up sessions. We know some of our members have been impacted by exclusionary and discriminatory practices and invite those of marginalized identities and allies to join a focus group to share their experiences. This will be a space for members to respectfully and safely talk about their lived experiences. For more information on these sessions, please click the link in the description. Additional sessions will be added as the meetings reach capacity.
You're listening to the Lowdown podcast, brought to you by Sigma Kappa National Headquarters staff. We'll focus on topics like health, wellness, the fraternity and sorority community, higher education, and life skills that women need in all stages of their lives. We'll also feature stories from inspiring and empowering Sigma Kappas. Check out the Sigma Kappa website for regular updates and new episodes.
Welcome to the Lowdown podcast. I am Mallory Simmons, Director of Publications at Sigma Kappa National Headquarters, and I will be serving as one of your hosts for this episode.
And I'm Annika Dellert, the Educational Support Manager at Sigma Kappa National Headquarters, and I'll be your other host. Mallory and I served as staff liaisons for the History Task Force, which we'll be diving into in this episode of the podcast.
Today, we are very excited to be talking to the two co-chairs of our History Task Force, Christy Nielson and Allison Parker. In case you haven't seen the Winter 22 issue of the Sigma Kappa Triangle, it featured an article about the past, present, and future of Sigma Kappa, specifically relating to issues of diversity, equity, inclusion, and access. And the History Task Force was the main source of research and information contained in that article. And they also created the recommendations of how to use this historical information moving forward toward a more equitable organization. So in this podcast, we'll take you behind the scenes, so to speak, of the History Task Force and talk about how the research was done, some of the most interesting things we found while doing this research, as well as what's next for the History Task Force. So first, Christy and Allison, could you please tell us a little bit more about yourselves?
Sure. Thank you so much for having us. This is Christy, and I am a University of Kansas graduate, Xi chapter. I currently live in Oregon and am in the process of relocating to Dallas, Texas. I'm a public relations professional and a freelance writer, so I work with clients across all spectrums to tell their stories, basically. And so it was an honor and a privilege to have the opportunity to tell this story on behalf of our organization.
And I'm Allison Parker, and I proudly represent the Alpha Gamma chapter from Washington State University. Go Cougs! And we're going to be celebrating our centennial a year late this spring, so I'm really looking forward to that. I live in Washington, D.C., and like Christy, I also work in PR and marketing, but I've spent most of my career working with tech companies, and so helping to take more technical stories and kind of translate them for audiences that may or may not be particularly technically inclined. And so I too really enjoyed being able to use my background in storytelling and in communications to be able to help tell these really important stories with the task force.
Thank you. So Allison, can you tell us a little bit about the background of the History Task Force, the charge, and a little about its members?
Sure. So the task force was formed in late 2020 to research. It was formed by National Council to research, document, and acknowledge Sigma Kappa's history, specifically as it relates to organizational discrimination, but also to take a look at any historical steps the organization had taken toward inclusion. So we researched really only known instances of organizational discrimination, not acts of discrimination by individual members or those individual stories that we knew of that were sort of one-on-one. The task force consisted of 8 Sigma Kappa alumni and then 2 staff members, you and Annika, of course. And really, the task force members brought a pretty wide variety of academic and professional experience into this group and into this research, but very relevant experience in the study of American history and contextualization, managing archives and doing archival research. And then we had a couple of task force folks who specifically were working in higher education. So we really had an interesting mix of people who brought their professional experience to bear in this research. And then on top of all that, while we were doing the research for over a year, I think we spent about 13 or 14 months doing this research. So on top of the time put into researching Sigma Kappa's history, we also just had life stuff going on. Our task force members, I think, had 2 weddings and 3 babies and just all the other sort of stuff of life that goes on during the pandemic and homeschooling and all that kind of stuff. So I think it really was remarkable how committed the task force members were to this work in the midst of everything else that was going on. And many of those task force members also were doing other volunteer work for Sigma Kappa at the same time. So it's a really interesting, fun group of women to get to know and a really committed group. And it was really a pleasure to be able to work with them.
Truly an impressive and inspirational group of women. I frequently told them that I wanted to be them when I grew up. So hearing again about them just makes me think that again. So Christy, where did the History Task Force start with its research?
Yeah, so the national organization had already identified a few dark spots in our history with regards to the chapters at Tufts and Cornell being closed after pledging Black women. And then there was also a question about the chapter closing at Syracuse, which we investigated. Additionally, 2 task force members, Maggie Morris and Dana Finley Morrison, had researched some chapter closures on their own before the task force was even formed. And so that research really provided an important jumpstart on what we were doing in our work. So from there, we just followed the breadcrumbs, so to speak, and we verified what we thought we knew and tried to fill in the gaps and what we didn't. When something new showed up, we would divide and conquer and dive into it to determine if it fit or not, always, as Allison mentioned, with a focus on organizational versus individual behavior. It's also important to acknowledge, I think, that other NPC groups had already done this work on the behalf of their organizations, on behalf of their own organizations, So Beth Wright from Alpha Delta Pi and Jess Patterson from Delta Gamma had done similar endeavors on behalf of their sororities. And these women were so very open about their experiences, and they were willing to share with us their processes for how they did their research and how they communicated what they learned to their members and the lessons that they learned along the way, since they had the benefit of being on the other side of this. And so it was just extremely helpful to talk with them. And we are so grateful for their pioneering efforts, for their openness and their guidance as we embarked on our own truth telling. In fact, Allison and I had conversations with these women before we even had our first task force meeting, which was so helpful. And then, and then toward the end of our research, Beth from AD Pi ended up joining one of our task force calls to share with our members, more kind of firsthand about their experience, the feedback she got from her members, and to answer the questions that our task force members had. And she was just so very generous with her time, her knowledge, and her experience. And again, I just can't say how extremely grateful we are for that. And then also should note that the contextual timeline that AD Pi printed with their article was also a helpful starting point for task force member Jeannie Disney, who developed the contextual timeline that runs below our article and was, important for adding not only context for what was happening in Sigma Kappa at the time, but how that related to what was happening in, the general society at the time. So
this was truly an all hands on deck team effort. That's great.
Absolutely. Yes, for sure.
So what kind of resources did the History Task Force use to conduct this research?
Sure. So we really wanted to try and source as much as we could from Sigma Kappa's archives. We felt like that would confirm or at least give confidence to some of those word of mouth theories or word of mouth stories that we started with early on in our research. So, we started looking at official records like convention and national council meeting minutes, and they were helpful, but we also found that Sigma Kappa archives were somewhat inconsistent. In some cases, there were records that were intentionally missing. And so I think in the Triangle article, you noted this, the 1951 national membership policy was specifically handed down through word of mouth. And that was something that as people received it through word of mouth, they were told not to write it down. And so, when we went looking for something like that in the archives, of course, it wasn't there. It was intentionally missing. So, we did find a lot of what we were looking for in the Sigma Kappa archives, but certainly there were some inconsistencies there. And so early on in our research, we reached out to the libraries at Tufts and Cornell because those were a couple of the incidents that we were researching early on. And so we reached out to those libraries to get access to their Sigma Kappa archives and see what they might have that could be helpful in our research. And those were pretty valuable because they did include a lot of correspondence between alumni and campus leaders and Sigma Kappa leadership. And so that really helped us connect a lot of dots pretty early on. We also looked at local newspaper archives and campus newspaper archives to see how they were covering Sigma Kappa and the Greek system generally around the time of these incidents that we were researching. And that also kind of helped do some of that contextualizing as well. And then we also looked at yearbooks. So yearbooks, I think, maybe to the surprise of some of us on the task force, yearbooks turned out to be a pretty interesting and valuable resource because they helped us piece together particularly pieces of the story like some of those independent sororities that were formed after the chapters at Tufts and Cornell were closed. There were independent sororities that formed out of that. And so yearbooks were helpful in helping us understand the timing of that and who was involved and what the reception to those chapters or those new sororities was on campus. We also reached out to members of the chapters that we were researching and tried to document any memories that they were willing to share with us. And so that proved to be really fruitful and a really important piece of the story to tell as well. And so I think, by accessing this variety of resources, we were really able to confidently piece together this larger story, and we felt like we were able to pull together a pretty comprehensive story. One other thing I would point out is that about halfway through our research process, one of our task force members, Amanda Perez, connected us with a restorative justice trainer named Robert Rico. And so we learned in our conversations with Beth at ADPi that restorative justice was an approach that we were interested in taking. That was an approach that she had taken in her research, and it was something that really resonated with Christy and me when we spoke to her about it. So in particular, there are 3 restorative justice objectives that I think really resonated with us. And so one is to identify the injustice, 2 is to make things right, and then the 3rd is to consider future intentions. And as we learned about that, that really felt like something we could that we could apply not only to our research, but that ultimately we would be able to apply to our outcomes and to our recommendations. And so Amanda was able to connect us with a restorative justice trainer named Robert Rico. And we, as a task force, met with Robert, and he helped us understand how we could apply these restorative justice principles to this work and how we could eventually develop our recommendations to National Council within that framework of restorative justice. I guess the last thing I would mention is our work with Sigma Kappa's DEI consultant, Marlon Gibson. We were really fortunate to be able to work with him and get some really valuable feedback from him on the Triangle article and on the letters of apology that were part of our recommendations to National Council, and on the reflection session that we held in March right after the article came out. So Marlon was pretty instrumental in helping facilitate that and helping sort of guide us in how we wanted to construct that session. So, it took a village. And I think there were a lot of resources, a lot of really valuable resources available to us. And so we were really fortunate to be able to access both the archives and the people. And, as Christy said, a lot of people were really generous in sharing their knowledge with us.
The task force certainly made use of all of those resources, and it was very fun to be the one supporting it along the way for you all. So loved that. Okay, so arguably one of the questions that our members are probably dying to know, what is the most interesting thing that you learned through this work?
Yeah, that is such a good question. And it's hard to come up with just one thing, but I would say it goes back to the oral histories that Allison mentioned. So the oral history interviews that were conducted with the members who lived through these experiences just were so fascinating and really so moving. And they added such an important dimension to our work and rounded out the story that was published in the Triangle so beautifully. Connecting with these women also provided just an awesome opportunity for the organization to apologize directly to them for the harm that these actions caused. And so task force member Nicole Pawelski helped to identify which sisters to reach out to at each chapter. That's kind of how this worked. And then Steffi Greenhill led the charge on interviewing these women. Steffi has significant experience in archival research, and she has incredible knowledge about best practices for conducting oral history research. And she really did a great job with these interviews. And I think, I think everyone would agree that they were just such an impactful and important part of the story that was told. And it was moving to hear the firsthand experiences of those women. So I would say that was the most interesting thing. And a lot of those women were so inspirational. It's just those chapters were doing the right thing at a time when the national organization wasn't. And to hear about their bravery and their courage and their steadfast determination, to stand up to what was not right, was really inspiring.
Yes, I agree. Those oral histories were so interesting. And I really hope that we will be able to publish at least a few of them in full on our new history website so that everyone who wants to can get that added context and detail about what it was really like to live through these times and these instances. So what did you find that wasn't able to be included in the article?
Oh, I think I almost want to answer that backwards and tell you something we didn't find. Christy mentioned Syracuse earlier, and we had heard kind of through word of mouth that racial tensions might have played a role in the closure of the Syracuse chapter, which we think was around 1972 or 1973. But we weren't able to find anyone who had direct knowledge or really find any archival documents or any. I remember looking even at the Syracuse newspaper. I don't think we even found anything in the Syracuse newspaper that helped us establish what really happened there or why that chapter closed. So I thought that was interesting, that we couldn't really come up with a solid, sort of answer or really any solid path to figure out what happened there. So I think that's still an opportunity for research. We did, however, I believe after the article was published, we received a message from a member of the Epsilon chapter who was there about 10 years prior to the closing of the chapter. And she mentioned the initiation of a woman of Puerto Rican descent that year in 1961. And we think that she could have been the first Hispanic woman to have been initiated into Sigma Kappa. And so, we'd love to try and get in touch with her at some point. And so I think that, everything related to that time period, kind of that 10-year period at Syracuse, is still a really interesting opportunity for research, as much for what we couldn't find as what we were able to learn. So.
That would be so fascinating. The oral histories are really a huge part of this and are always great to understand and learn more. So with the apology letters that were a part of the recommendations of the task force, Can you tell more about these apology letters and what some of the response has been from those letters?
Sure. So as Allison mentioned, as part of the restorative justice approach to all of this, it was important to, reach out directly and apologize for these, wrongs based on what we learned. And so this was one of the task force recommendations that were submitted to the National Council. And so the letters were sent to the women who were members of Cornell and Tufts chapters in 1956. And then a formal apology letter was also sent to the members of the University of Minnesota chapter. And that's the chapter that gave up their charter in 1961 because they didn't agree with Sigma Kappa's policies, and they did the right thing really in a time where it wasn't the norm. So that was an apology and praise letter kind of all in one. So these letters were sent directly to the women who we had contact information for. And they were also published on the Sigma Kappa website, and then also sent to the universities to share via their alumni channels. And the responses were really overwhelming. We heard back from a number of the women who were both surprised and grateful to hear from the organization after all this time. And I would say their graciousness was just really humbling and very gratifying. So we really hope that at the very least, these women can find comfort in knowing that all these years later, their bravery continues to inspire reflection and change in our organization.
Absolutely. I found them so inspiring, and they were really the embodiment of that bravery and boldness that we advocate for all Sigma Kappas today. And we are just so lucky to be able to call them sisters and to have them to look up to and to model ourselves off of. And I really hope that our fellow members have drawn some inspiration from them as well.
Absolutely. Yes.
So as Allison mentioned earlier, the History Task Force work has gone on now for over a year, and it was only supposed to operate for 1 year. But one of the recommendations was continuing it on for at least another year. So what is next for the History Task Force?
So the work at the task force really culminated with the Sigma Kappa Triangle article, but it's clear to us that there is more work to do. We've started hearing from folks who read the article or women who participated in our reflection session back in March. And some of them have shared stories of organizational discrimination with us, or they've asked that we specifically explore areas like religious discrimination. And then, as I mentioned earlier, we know about things like the closing of the Syracuse chapter, but we're still not really sure why it closed. And so we just have little breadcrumbs here and there that we'd like to continue to follow up on, and we'd like to continue to see, where that leads. So one of our recommendations as a task force was that National Council should form an ongoing committee. So convert the task force to an ongoing committee so that this work can continue and this research can kind of continue in perpetuity. And so that is going to happen. The History Task Force is going to be converted to a standing committee. So in the future, anyone will be able to apply for a 1-year appointment to that committee to serve either as a committee chair or as a committee member. And then at one time, Sigma Kappa actually had a director of archives on staff. So we've also recommended resurrecting that position, but with some slight changes. So that's actually going to become a 2-year volunteer appointment called Director of History. And it's going to have a focus not only on collecting and preserving materials for Sigma Kappa's archives, but also on interpreting those materials. And we felt like that was a really important change to the job description because the interpretation of the material is so important to just sort of figuring out what belongs in our archives and how it impacts our history, how it impacts our future, and sort of what contextual significance it has. And so we've added that interpretation piece to that job description as well. The Director of History will also serve on the History Committee. And so once that committee has been formed and has members appointed to it, then they'll be able to prioritize their research and their next steps. but certainly we have, some ideas and some recommendations that we could pass on to them based on the work that we've done already. And I would say, it's likely that some task force members will probably apply to be part of that newly formed committee, just to try and create some continuity. But I really would encourage, and I think I can speak for Christy as well, really would encourage anybody who's listening who has an interest or has experience in archival research or in oral histories or any of this sort of storytelling work, we really would encourage them to apply to be part of this committee, because it's incredibly rewarding and is just it's just such a wonderful way to be able to give back to Sigma Kappa as well and really help shine light on our history.
As the committee and director of history are in the process of being appointed, if members have a topic or research area that they would like the History Task Force to investigate, how can they let you know?
That's a great question. And I think it's going to be a really important component, of the History Committee's work moving forward. So I would encourage anyone who has, experience or information to share to send an email to history@sigmakappa.org. So this email, while the committee is being formulated and the director of history is being, that position's being advertised and filled, this email is being monitored by staff, and any of the information sent here, I think, will just be incredibly helpful as the History Committee embarks on its efforts to continue the work that was started by the task force. So,
yes, and we know from the incredible amounts of feedback that we have received from the Sigma Kappa Triangle article that this is a topic that our members are really interested in, really invested in. And I personally can't wait for, to see what's next from the History Task Force and what new information we are able to dig up and share with our members. So I want to thank Christy and Allison so much for their time today and for their dedication to this project. It was so fascinating to be a part of this History Task Force, sometimes disheartening, sometimes uplifting, but ultimately it is so important to the future of our organization. And hopefully, as this work continues, we will learn more about Sigma Kappa's past and how we can use that knowledge to create a stronger future for our organization. And I want to thank Christy and Allison so much for their time today and for their dedication to this project.
Thank you so much for having us. And I also want to take a moment just to thank the staff for your incredible support of this endeavor. You were instrumental in helping keep Allison and I on task and keeping us organized and making sure we had the access to any resources that we needed to do our work. And then, of course, in compiling the article, which was so well done. So just a word of thanks for Mallory and Annika for everything you contributed to the task force. Thank you so very much.
The entire task force felt really supported throughout this process by National Council and their openness and their willingness to let us look around corners and look in, dark hiding places and really uncover some uncomfortable things. And, they really encouraged us to sort of see where this research took us and to not hold back. And so I think we felt very heartened by that and very supported by that, and really encouraged that they embraced our recommendations as well and embraced them so wholeheartedly and have been taking action on those recommendations. So I think it's important to acknowledge that and also to thank National Council for that. So thank you. And Mallory, thank you again for having us. This was a lot of fun.
Well, I think I can speak for everyone when I say it was my pleasure. It was so fascinating to be a part of this project, sometimes disheartening, but ultimately it's so important to the future of our organization. And hopefully, as we continue this work, we will learn more about Sigma Kappa's past and how we can use that knowledge to move forward to create a stronger future. So thank you so much, Christy and Allison, and thank you for listening to the Lowdown podcast.